On the damn morning of April 14th, 1998, the county appraisal truck stopped beside 42 acres of forgotten ground just outside Marion County, Tennessee. The driver stepped out, looked across the waist-high weeds, the patches of exposed limestone, and the shallow pools of rainwater that never seemed to dry, then shook his head before writing another note on his clipboard. The land was officially listed as low-value pasture. Farmers in the area had another name for it. Worthless. It had defeated cattle, swallowed tractor tires after heavy storms, and refused to grow enough hay to justify cutting it. Buyers came once or twice every decade, walked its uneven ground for 10 minutes, and quietly left without making an offer. Standing near an old split-rail fence was Harold Whitaker, 72 years old, wearing faded denim bib overalls, cracked leather boots polished only by years of walking, and a weathered brown cap whose stitching had begun to disappear sometime during the 1980s. His hands looked more like oak roots than fingers. His blue eyes never hurried. Neither did he. The county appraiser folded his papers. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "I'm afraid this parcel isn't worth improving. I'd lease it for hunting if I were you." Harold smiled politely. "I've got another plan." The appraiser looked around once more. "You can't farm rocks." "No," Harold answered softly, "but you can farm what's hiding under them." The younger man frowned. He assumed the old farmer had finally grown tired enough to start imagining things. He drove away without asking another question. Harold simply watched the dust settle before turning toward the machine parked beside his weathered barn, a 1951 Farm LM, 44 drawbar horsepower, nearly 6,000 pounds of cast iron, faded red paint worn almost pink by decades beneath Tennessee sunshine. Its engine had not been started yet that morning. Even standing still, it felt alive. Let me tell you about that tractor. Harold's father, Thomas Whitaker, bought it brand new from a dealership in Chattanooga during September 1951 for $2,215, paying half in cash after selling tobacco and financing the rest through the local agricultural bank. The farmer replaced 3 exhausted mules that had worked the family's hills since the 1930s. Thomas believed machinery should never be treated like furniture. "You don't own a tractor," he used to tell Harold. "You borrow it from the next generation." Every November, the oil was changed whether it needed it or not. Every grease fitting received fresh lubricant. Every bolt that rattled loose was tightened before supper. When Thomas passed away in 1984, Harold inherited the farm along with one sentence that never left him: "If she starts on the second pull, you've waited too long." So every week, whether there was work or not, Harold started the tractor, let the engine warm until the exhaust settled into its familiar rhythm, then drove one slow lap around the farm. Neighbors laughed at the ritual. Harold never explained it. Machine forgotten too long, forget their owners. By the spring of 1998, agriculture around Marion County was changing. Larger operations were buying smaller farms. New equipment arrived with enclosed cabs, electronic monitoring systems, and engines producing more than 100 horsepower. Younger farmers measured success by acres planted per hour. Harold measured it differently. He counted healthy soil, reliable equipment, promises kept. His daughter, Emily, visited every Saturday with groceries and fresh coffee. "You don't have to keep working, Dad." "I'm not working." She smiled. "What are you doing then?" "I'm listening." "Listening to what?" "The ground." She laughed gently, knowing better than to argue. The old farmer had spent 50 years reading fields the way other people read newspapers. One evening, while repairing an old cedar fence, Harold noticed something unusual beneath a flat limestone slab near the wettest corner of the property. Hundreds of snails, large ones, healthy ones, not scattered randomly, gathered together. He returned the following morning, then the next, then every morning for 2 weeks. The population kept growing. Most people saw pests. Harold saw evidence. He drove 23 miles to the public library in Jasper, Tennessee, where an agricultural journal from 1996 described growing demand for edible snails in specialty restaurants across North America and Europe. Imports supplied most of the market, but domestic producers remained surprisingly rare. Harold checked out every publication the librarian could locate: biology, humidity, breeding cycles, calcium requirements, market prices. He filled an entire notebook. When he finally closed the last book, he whispered something that made the librarian look up from her desk. "The land's been trying to tell me this all along. Let me tell you about snail farming. It sounds unusual because very few Americans ever see it, but raising edible land snails, known as heliciculture, depends less on rich soil than on moisture, shelter, calcium, and careful management. Rocky ground that frustrates corn and soybeans can actually support healthy snail. Colonies are protected from predators and excessive heat. It isn't easy work. Growth takes patience. But patience was something Harold had accumulated over a lifetime. He began drawing careful plans. Small breeding pens, wooden shelters, shade cloth, natural vegetation, rainwater collection barrels. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, everything practical. Word travels quickly in farming communities. Within 3 weeks, people were already asking questions. What are you building? You finally getting goats? Starting a fish pond? Harold simply smiled. No. So what's it for? You'll see. Nobody believed him, least of all Brian Keller. 38 years old, vice president of Volunteer Agricultural Bank. Brian had earned an MBA, drove a spotless pickup, wore pressed blue shirts beneath tailored jackets, and believed every profitable farm operation could be explained with spreadsheets. He respected efficiency. He respected numbers. He did not respect impossible ideas. When Harold requested a modest $18,000 operating loan on May 18, 1998, Brian reviewed the application twice before looking over the top of his glasses. Mr. Whitaker, yes, your business plan says you're going to raise. He paused. 5,000 snails. Harold nodded once. That's right. Brian stared silently for several seconds. Then he laughed. Not quietly, not politely. Loud enough for 3 customers waiting in line to turn around. One teller covered her smile. Another customer chuckled. Brian leaned back in his chair. 5,000 snails? On that swampy rock pile outside town. Harold never reacted. He rested both weathered hands on the edge of the desk. If that's what the land grows best, that's what I'll raise. Brian shook his head. I financed dairy barns, poultry houses, tobacco farms, and cattle operations. But snails? The room filled with laughter again. Harold tipped his cap. I appreciate your time. He stood, turned, walked slowly toward the door, without a trace of anger. Just before leaving, he looked back one final time. I hope someday, he said calmly, you'll come see what everyone laughed at. Brian smiled as the old man disappeared through the bank's front door. He thought the conversation was over. He had no idea it had only just begun. 3 weeks later, something arrived on Harold Whitaker's wasted land that nobody in Marion County expected to see. 3 weeks later, just after sunrise on June 9th, 1998, a flatbed truck rolled slowly down Whitaker Road, carrying something that made passing drivers slow almost to a stop. It wasn't livestock. It wasn't lumber. It wasn't fertilizer. It was hundreds of neatly stacked wooden breeding boxes, rolls of shade cloth, galvanized water troughs, fine mesh fencing, and pallet after pallet of crushed agricultural limestone. The driver climbed down from the cab. You Harold Whitaker? I am. Got everything you ordered. Harold signed the receipt with slow, steady handwriting. The total came to $11,842. Nearly every dollar he had saved over the previous 12 years after the bank refused his loan. He had sold an unused hay wagon, an old cattle trailer, and nearly all the scrap iron sitting behind the barn. His neighbors thought he had finally lost his senses. Harold believed he had finally found them. The 1951 farm will cough once before settling into its familiar, deep rhythm. The old tractor eased forward, pulling a homemade trailer stacked with cedar posts cut from trees that had grown along the creek decades earlier. No hydraulic loader, no enclosed cab, no satellite guidance, just cast iron patience and experience. By sunset, the first enclosure stood complete. It covered less than half an acre. To anyone else, it looked unimpressive. To Harold, It looked like the beginning of a conversation with the land. The following Saturday, Emily arrived carrying sandwiches and lemonade. She walked around the enclosure twice before stopping beside her father. "So, this is really happening." "It is. You know everyone thinks you're crazy." Harold smiled. "They've earned that opinion. And if they're right, then I'll still have learned something." Emily looked across the wasted field. "You've always been different." "No." Harold rested one hand on a cedar fence post. "I've just never been afraid of being early." That afternoon, together they spread crushed limestone across the breeding pens. The calcium served an important purpose. Healthy snail shells are built largely from calcium carbonate. Without enough available calcium, shells become thin, brittle, and vulnerable to disease or predators. Harold understood that before buying his first breeding stock. His research had become practical knowledge. Every decision had a reason. Let me tell you about Harold's notebook. It wasn't fancy, just a weathered black ledger with graph paper inside. Every page contained dates, temperatures, humidity readings, rainfall totals, feed mixtures, breeding observation, hatch counts, and sketches of enclosure designs. His handwriting was careful enough that another farmer could have followed every step years later. Thomas Whitaker had taught him something else. If you don't write it down, memory will improve the story and ruin the lesson. Harold never forgot those words. By early July, his first breeding colony arrived from a licensed producer in the Midwest. Exactly 5,000 juvenile edible snails, each barely larger than thumbnail. The delivery driver looked puzzled. "I usually haul cattle." Harold chuckled. "Everybody starts somewhere." Releasing them took nearly 3 hours. The snails disappeared beneath leafy cover almost immediately. Silence returned. Nothing dramatic happened. No cheering. No miracle. Just 5,000 tiny lives beginning work nobody else could see. Across town, Brian Keller heard about the shipment during lunch. One of the bank tellers laughed while stirring her coffee. "Your snail farmer finally bought his snails." Brian grinned. "He actually did it?" 5,000 of them. Another employee joined in. "I heard he's building fences to keep snails from escaping." The room erupted in laughter. Brian couldn't help himself. "I should have approved the loan." Everyone looked at him. So the bank could own 5,000 snails after foreclosure. The laughter grew louder. No one noticed the elderly mechanic, sitting quietly in the corner. His name was Ray Collins. He had repaired Harold's farmel for nearly 20 years. As he stood to leave, he looked directly at Brian. "You know." Brian turned. "What?" "I've seen smarter men laugh at Harold before." Brian shrugged. "And they all ended up apologizing." Ray walked out without another word. The sentence lingered far longer than anyone admitted. By August, the enclosures had become part of Harold's daily rhythm. Morning inspection, moisture check, feed distribution, fence inspection, predator control, record keeping, evening inspection, every single day. No shortcuts. One humid afternoon, Brian happened to drive past the property while visiting another customer. Curiosity got the better of him. He turned into the gravel lane. Harold was repairing a section of mesh fence with fencing pliers older than Brian himself. "You actually built all this?" "I did." Brian climbed out of his truck. He looked around. Wooden shelters, green vegetation, moist soil, neatly organized pathways. Everything looked professional, not ridiculous. Professional. "I expected." Brian hesitated. "What?" "I don't know." "A circus." Brian laughed awkwardly. "Maybe." Harold handed him a pair of work gloves. "Help me stretch this fence." Brian blinked. "You want me to help?" "You're already here." Without really understanding why, Brian took the gloves. For 15 quiet minutes they worked side by side. No arguments. No speeches. Just two men tightening wire beneath the Tennessee sun. Finally, Brian asked a question. "Why snails?" Harold looked across the field. "Because everyone else was trying to force this land to become something it wasn't. And you? I'm letting it become what it already wanted to be." Brian didn't answer. The words settled somewhere deeper than he expected. Before leaving, He noticed a farm parked beside the barn. "You still trust that old tractor?" Harold smiled. "I trust anything that's earned it." Brian nodded politely, but inside he remained unconvinced. The first real test arrived in September 1998. An unusually dry month settled across Marion County. Rain stopped. Temperatures climbed above 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity dropped. Snails depend heavily on moisture. Without it, they retreat into their shells, stop feeding, and growth slows dramatically. Every producer in the region worried. Harold didn't panic. He adjusted. Rain barrels collected from earlier storms fed a simple gravity irrigation system made from recycled PVC pipe and tiny drilled openings. Water flowed gently every evening. No electric pumps. No expensive equipment. Just gravity doing exactly what gravity has always done. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Maybe it wasn't land. Maybe it wasn't machinery. Maybe it was an idea everyone dismissed before it ever had the chance to grow. Most people abandon those things because ridicule feels heavier than failure. Harold understood something different. Ideas don't need applause. They need time. The drought continued. Fields nearby turned brown. Hay yields dropped. Corn curled beneath relentless heat. Yet inside Harold's shaded enclosures, life continued. Slowly, quietly, steadily. Then, during the first week of October, Emily walked into one of the breeding pens carrying her father's notebook. She stopped, looked closer, then called out across the field, "Dad." Harold hurried as fast as a 72-year-old farmer could. Emily pointed toward the damp soil beneath one of the wooden shelters. Thousands of tiny translucent hatchlings covered the ground. The first successful generation had arrived. Harold removed his cap, not to celebrate, to give thanks. He whispered only 4 words. The land was right. But less than 48 hours later, headlights appeared at the end of the gravel road just after midnight, and whoever stepped out of that truck wasn't there to admire 5,000 snails. The headlights remained motionless for nearly a minute. Harold watched from the porch without turning on a single light. The truck finally rolled through the open gate just after 12:18 a.m. on October 9th, 1998. It was a dark green pickup. No company logo, no farm plates, just dust covering the doors. 2 men climbed out carrying flashlights. Harold recognized neither of them. He slipped into his boots, picked up an old lantern instead of flashlight, and walked toward the breeding pens with the same unhurried pace he had carried through life for more than 70 years. "Evening," he called. Both men turned sharply. One cleared his throat. "We heard you got snails." "I do." "We'd like to see them." Harold raised the lantern slightly. "At midnight." The taller man smiled nervously. "We were passing through." Harold had lived too long to mistake curiosity for intention. He noticed one of the men glancing repeatedly toward the mesh fencing. Another kept looking at the wooden breeding shelters. Neither asked about the animals. Both asked about the fences. "How many are inside?" "Enough." "Anybody helping you watch them?" "I've got all the help I need." The 2 strangers exchanged a quick look. One thanked Harold politely. They climbed back into the truck and disappeared into the darkness. The old farmer watched their taillights until they vanished around the bend. The next morning, he added stronger gate latches, reinforced every enclosure, and installed simple mechanical alarms made from fishing line tied to empty metal cans. Cheap, reliable, impossible to ignore. Emily noticed them immediately. "You think someone will come back?" Harold nodded once. Success attracts attention. And attention isn't always friendly. 3 days later, his prediction proved correct. Just before dawn, the cans rattled violently. Harold stepped outside, carrying nothing more than a lantern and a walking stick. Whoever had entered the property heard the noise and fled before reaching the breeding pens. Only muddy boot prints remained. The sheriff photographed them. Nothing more came of the investigation, but word spread quickly through Marion County. People who had laughed at Harold were suddenly asking a different question. If someone tried to steal them, maybe those snails are actually worth something. That single rumor changed everything. Within weeks, specialty food distributors from Nashville, Atlanta, and even Louisville began making phone calls after hearing whispers about a small Tennessee farm producing premium edible snails. Harold answered every call the same way. "I won't promise what I can't deliver." Some buyers lost interest. The serious ones stayed. Let me tell you about patience in farming. Most businesses measure success by how quickly money arrives. Real farming measures success by how consistently life grows. A calf cannot be rushed. An orchard cannot be hurried. Neither can a healthy snail colony. Harold refused every offer that required cutting corners or harvesting before the animals reached proper size. He protected his reputation before he protected his income. That decision would eventually become worth far more than any early contract. In November 1998, representatives from a specialty foods distributor visited the farm. Among them was Laura Simmons, purchasing manager for a company supplying high-end restaurants across the southeastern United States. She inspected the breeding pens carefully. She measured shell quality. She reviewed Harold's handwritten records. She checked moisture levels. Finally, she closed a notebook. "I've toured facilities 3 times this size." Harold waited. None of them kept records as carefully. Harold smiled. "My father taught me that details feed families." Laura extended her hand. "We'd like to buy your first commercial harvest." The agreement covered an initial shipment worth $27,400 if quality standards remained consistent. For Harold, it was more money than he'd earned from that 42-acre parcel in the previous 20 years combined. Emily hugged her father. He simply folded the contract, placed it inside his notebook, and returned to repairing a loose fence board. Nothing about him changed. Across town, Brian Keller received surprising news from one of his commercial clients. "That snail farmer? What about him? He's signing contracts." Brian frowned. "For how much?" The client mentioned the amount. Brian nearly dropped his coffee. "You're kidding." "I'm not." For the first time since laughing across his bank desk months earlier, Brian realized Harold Whitaker might have seen something that everyone else, including himself, had completely missed. The following Saturday, Brian drove back to the farm. This time, he didn't wear a jacket, just jeans and work boots. Harold was changing engine oil in the old Farmel M. "I figured she'd still be running." Harold looked up. "She usually is." Brian stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "I owe you something." Harold wiped his hands with an old cotton rag. "A conversation? An apology?" Silence settled between them. "I laughed at you." "You did." "I shouldn't have." "No. I judged an idea before I understood it." Harold nodded gently. "Most people do." Brian looked relieved that the old farmer wasn't angry. "I'd like to make it right." "You already have." "I haven't done anything." "You came back." Harold smiled. "That's harder than most people think." The 2 men spent the afternoon replacing worn fan belts on the Farmel. Not because Harold needed help, because Brian wanted to learn. While tightening the generator bracket, Brian asked something he'd never thought to ask before. Why has this tractor lasted almost 50 years? Harold leaned against the rear tire. Because it was built to work, not to impress. Let me tell you something about torque and horsepower. People often think horsepower alone determines how strong a tractor is, but that's only part of the story. Horsepower measures how quickly work can be done. Torque measures the twisting force that actually gets heavy loads moving. Older tractors like the 1951 Farmel M produce strong, steady torque at lower engine speeds. Their large displacement cast iron engines didn't need to spin fast to pull hard. That made them dependable for slow, demanding jobs. Modern tractors produce far more horsepower, but those old machines earned loyalty because they delivered power smoothly, predictably, and for decades with proper maintenance. That's why many are still working generations later. Brian nodded slowly. "I never understood that." Most people don't. Winter arrived early. Frost coated the pasture. The breeding colonies entered their natural dormant period. Harvest crews prepared the first commercial shipment. Wooden crates lined the packing shed. Each one carried Harold's simple farm stamp. Whitaker Farm, Marion County, Tennessee. Have you ever known you were right when everyone in the room insisted you were wrong? Not because you were louder, not because you argued better, but because experience kept whispering the answer while everyone else chased the obvious. Those moments test more than confidence. They test character. Harold had passed that test long before anyone noticed. On January 18, 1999, the refrigerated truck arrived to collect the first harvest. Emily stood beside her father. Brian arrived as well. So did Ray Collins. Even several neighbors who had laughed months earlier gathered quietly near the barn. No one joked this time. The driver finished loading the final crate. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, shifted into gear, then suddenly stopped. He stepped back out holding an envelope marked with Harold Whitaker's name. Inside was something Harold never expected to see, and it changed not only his farm, but Brian Keller's life forever. Harold turned the envelope over in his hands before opening it. The paper inside wasn't thick. It wasn't official looking. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply the payment statement for the first commercial shipment, leaving Whitaker Farm. He unfolded it carefully. Emily leaned closer. Brian stood quietly beside the loading dock. The driver waited. Harold adjusted his glasses and read the final line twice. Amount due, $28,615.40. Nobody spoke. For nearly 20 seconds, the only sound came from the old Farmel M idling beside the barn, its steady exhaust echoing across the frosty pasture. Emily finally whispered, "Dad." Harold smiled the same gentle smile he'd worn the day the county appraiser called the land worthless. I guess the ground knew. Brian looked down at his boots. Months earlier, he had laughed in front of an entire bank. Now, he couldn't find the right words. "I'm sorry, Harold." The old farmer folded the payment statement and slipped it into the same black notebook that contained every observation he'd written since the first day he noticed those wild snails beneath the limestone. "I know. I should have listened." Harold rested a weather hand on Brian's shoulder. "No." Brian looked confused. "You should have learned. There's a difference." That sentence stayed with Brian long after the truck disappeared down the gravel road. Within 6 months, Whitaker Farm had expanded from 1 breeding enclosure to 5. Not because Harold wanted to become rich, because the market kept asking for more than he could produce. Restaurants in Nashville, Knoxville, and Atlanta placed standing orders months in advance. Agricultural magazines began calling. University researchers asked to visit. Extension agents who had once dismissed the idea now brought other farmers to see the operation with their own eyes. The strange little farm outside Marion County had quietly become one of the best-known heliciculture operations in the region. Harold greeted every visitor exactly the same way. "Come look." No speeches, no boasting, just open gates. One spring afternoon, Brian returned again. This time he wasn't carrying loan papers. He was carrying coffee. The 2 men sat on overturned buckets beside the farmel. "I've changed the way I approve loans," Brian admitted. Harold raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I stopped asking whether an idea is familiar. And what do you ask now?" "I ask whether the farmer understands it better than I do." Harold nodded. "That's a better question." Brian smiled. "I financed 3 unusual farms this year." "How are they doing?" "They're all still in business." Harold chuckled softly. "Turns out imagination isn't a bad investment." The old Farmel M never stopped working. Every spring it pulled trailers loaded with cedar posts. Every summer it hauled limestone and feed. Every autumn it carried harvested crates to the packing shed. Children who visited the farm often asked why Harold didn't buy a newer tractor. He would pat the faded red hood. "This one still keeps its promises." The paint continued to fade. The seat was repaired twice. The clutch was replaced once. But the engine never failed. Machines built with patience often reward patience in return. 5 years passed. By 2004, Whitaker Farm had become a small family business, employing several local residents. Emily had left her office job to work beside her father. She introduced better record systems, refrigeration improvements, and direct sales to specialty markets. Harold insisted on keeping one tradition. Every new employee spent their first morning walking the 42 acres before doing any work. When they asked why, he always answered the same way. If you don't know the land, you'll never understand the work. The once abandoned pasture now supported healthy vegetation, birds, insects, and carefully managed breeding areas. The place everyone had called useless had become productive without ever pretending to be something it wasn't. 10 years later, in the autumn of 2008, Harold Whitaker celebrated his 82nd birthday. The county held a small agricultural appreciation dinner. Among the speakers was Brian Keller, standing behind the podium. He looked toward Harold before addressing the room. I once laughed at this man. The audience became silent. I thought education had taught me everything I needed to know. He smiled. It hadn't. It took an elderly farmer standing on land everyone called worthless to teach me that wisdom and intelligence are not always found in the same place. The applause lasted several minutes. Harold simply tipped his cap. Nothing more. That was enough. Harold passed away peacefully during the winter of 2012, surrounded by Emily, his grandchildren, and photographs of 4 generations of Whitakers. The evening before, he had asked only one question. Did somebody start the farm this week? Emily smiled through tears. I did. Good. Those were among the last words he spoke. The tractor remained exactly where he had parked it. The next Saturday morning, Emily walked into the barn, turned the fuel valve, adjusted the choke, and pressed the starter. The old engine came alive almost immediately. Its familiar rumble rolled across the same fields Harold had walked for half a century. Neighbors stopped what they were doing. They knew exactly what that sound meant. The Whitaker farm was still moving forward. Today, visitors still come to that corner of Marion County. Some arrive because they are curious about snail farming. Others come because they heard a story about an old farmer who refused to give up on forgotten land. Most leave talking about something entirely different. They leave talking about patience, about listening, about paying attention before passing judgment. The Farmal M still starts. Emily still keeps Harold's black notebook in a glass cabinet inside the farm office. Its pages are worn, its corners are bent, but every lesson remains exactly where Harold left it. Some visitors ask which page contains a secret that made the farm successful. Emily always smiles. The whole notebook. Because success was never hidden in one clever idea. It was built one careful day after another. One observation. One repair. One quiet decision. One promise kept. And perhaps that was Harold Whitaker's greatest harvest. Not the money. Not the recognition. Not even the 5,000 snails that transformed forgotten land into a thriving farm. His greatest harvest was proving that the value of land is often limited only by the imagination of the person willing to understand it. Some land isn't waiting for better farmers. It's waiting for someone willing to see what everyone else has overlooked. If Harold's story reminded you of someone in your own life, a farmer, a mechanic, a grandparent, or anyone who quietly proved the doubters wrong, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Stories like these deserve to be remembered because they're part of the history that built rural America. And if you like another remarkable tale, the next story follows an elderly farmer who rescued a forgotten 1948 grain drill from a collapsing barn, only for it to uncover a family secret buried for nearly 50 years. I hope you'll be here for that one, too.